Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. I'm Christina Costa-Connolly, guest hosting from London, and today we're joined by Ben Hookway. He's the CEO of Relative Insight, and he took the company from an academic spin-out into a commercial SaaS platform that's being used by leading customer-centric organizations like Sky, Nespresso, and Formula One. Ben has over 20 years' experience in early stage technology, founding and funding companies. He spent 6 years in the US and has extensive experience in China, South Korea, and Taiwan, both with startups and billion-dollar corporations. Relative Insight is an innovator in text analytics, and its technology helps brands effectively engage with their customers through a deeper understanding of how different audiences speak. Thanks for joining us, Ben. I hope I got that intro okay.
It makes me feel like I've had too long a career, but it was pretty accurate. Thanks very much. I'm glad to be here.
No problem. So can you just start by telling us a bit more about Relative Insight and what it is you do?
Sure. So Relative Insight is a text analytics platform. So we're an analytic layer which customers use to analyze the text data that they already have but aren't getting enough value out of. So examples of text data might be, for example, open ends in surveys. It could be review data. It could be IDI. It could be social. So those are all the kind of classic, I'd say, consumer insight sources. But then we also do a lot of work with customer experience or CX data. So NPS surveys, call transcripts, things like that. So those are the typical data sources we work with. But we're source agnostic. If it's text, we can analyze it. But those are the key things. So that's what the company does. I guess what's probably more important is kind of like why we do it. Like, so why are we in the text analytics game? Yeah. So we believe that text holds enormous potential for companies because it's one of the fundamental data sources that answers the question why things happen. So, most, execs or C-suite or VPs, if you ask them what their primary sources of business intelligence are, they tend to name quant sources. So NPS score, sales, margin, website traffic, things like this. And these are all like super important. But if you take, say, for example, NPS, it's really important to know whether your NPS is going up or going down. But that's just kind of telling you what is happening.
Exactly. That's the first step in understanding, right?
Correct. But if you're doing open ends in your NPS surveys, proper analysis of the open end text will tell you why it is going up or going down. And so this why question, we're seeing more and more demand for boards, C-suites, VP level to get more why data sources in, and text is everywhere. It's largely untapped, and you can do much smarter things with it, and that's what we do. And I'd say anyone who's listening to this, if you're rolling your eyes and thinking word cloud, don't worry, we don't do that kind of stuff. It's much more advanced than that, and you can get a lot more out of your data than doing basic word clouds. So that's kind of why we do what we do.
How do you do it? What makes you different to what's currently out there for clients looking at that sort of data?
So I've been in sort of commercialization of tech for all of my career, and every vendor that anyone ever comes across says they're differentiated. In this case, it genuinely is true. And that we're differentiated because of the technique we use, and that is a result of our background. So what we specialize in is comparative text analytics, comparing one data set to another and understanding the differences. And this approach goes back to our original purpose in life. So originally, Relative Insight was an academic collaboration with UK government agencies to catch people who were masquerading online. And originally, actually, our purpose in life was to, mainly in child protection, trying to catch people who are pretending to be kids. So we know if you're a 13-year-old girl online, or if you're a 40-year-old man doing a very good impression of a 13-year-old girl. Now, that is a difficult problem for all kinds of reasons, but from a data point of view, it's tricky because the bad guys are extremely good at doing it. So they would sound 95, 96% exactly the same as a real 13-year-old girl, to the point where if you were to take suspect language and put it through a regular text analytic algorithm, the algorithm would probably tell you it is a 13-year-old girl. So not a good outcome. So we had to kind of figure out how to solve the problem. And the way we solved the problem was, in that example, we would take verified databases of real 13-year-old girls from the security services. And then what we do is take suspect language and we compare them. And our output is the 4% or the 5% difference in the language. So though the bad guys were very good, they were never perfect. So rather than focusing on what they said, you need to focus on what's different between what they say and what the reference model says. And it's the differences that would eventually catch people, actually.
I mean, that's a really small margin, isn't it, to try and capture 4 or 5% that you've got to try and identify.
Yeah, but language is a weird thing, right? It's the ultimate sort of long tail data set. So it follows what's called a zip distribution. So what that means is, let's say in a body of text, let's say the most common word appears 10,000 times.
Yeah.
Well, the second most common word will appear 5,000 times, or half as frequently as the first. The third will then appear 2,500, so it halves again, and so on and so on and so on. So what you've got is quite small differences can actually make a big difference in the actual interpretation of the text. So it was incredibly effective as a technique, and it kind of, what it really does for the law enforcement agencies, it really directed them in the right way. So rather than having 1,000 cases to work on, they narrowed them down to 10, and when you've got constrained resource, you can really narrow down. So that's how it works. I'll maybe spare that, we went, we looked at other ways we could apply the tech. We were quite successful in law enforcement, and we were, involved in projects which meant some bad people got put away in jail, which is really great. But then we made this, we had this sort of parallel life of thinking about how else this can be applied in the commercial world. And that has turned out to be extraordinarily successful for us. We are sort of doubling every year. We got more of our customers in the US than we do in the UK now. So that's going very, very well. And as you say, we've got some real leading companies, who think about data in innovative ways, like Nespresso, Comcast, Sky, Prudential, MetLife, Formula One. There's some really great data-led companies out there who are using us
Can
to
you
solve.
tell us some of the examples of how they're using it, taking a technology that started in essentially law enforcement?
So I'll give you a few examples. So in the early days, when we got into this, here's a really good one. So this is quite old, but sort of is a good illustration. So we had a customer who is in the cosmetic business, and they were trying to target a younger group, a younger demographic. And what we had was a bunch of reviews in North America of people talking about cosmetics. So conventionally, what people would do is take that data and do a word cloud, and it said, it'd probably say cosmetics, foundation, eyeliner, whatever. So far, so uninteresting. It's like they just talk about cosmetics. But what we did is that we split that data up and then did a comparison. So we split it into 20 somethings reviewing makeup and 50 somethings reviewing makeup. And then you compare those two data sets. And 85% is exactly the same, because that's what you would expect. They're talking about cosmetics, but it's the differences that the customer is interested in. And the differences are things like, for example, if you're in your 20s, you tended to say you wear makeup, but if you're in your 50s, you tended to say you apply makeup. So that sounds almost trivial, but if you are trying to resonate and optimize your communications towards a particular audience, this stuff's crucial. And what's interesting about the technique is that it's a discovery technique rather than a search technique. So what I mean by that is quite often people will sort of have an idea and then look for evidence of their idea. And if you've got a lot of data, like, cosmetic reviews, that's a lot of words, you'll find instances of your idea, but it doesn't mean it's significant. It just means it's there.
That makes sense.
So no one would have thought to search for the word wear or search for the word apply. Okay, it's only by undertaking a comparison that you discover the differences. And as it happens, our customer was busy saying, apply our product every day for great results, when they were trying to resonate with the 20 somethings. So they were saying the wrong thing and not even knowing it. So that's a good example of taking a data set that people already had, and by doing the right comparison, you reveal a lot more information. So I'll give you another one as well. So we also worked on Diet Coke via a customer of ours. And they had a year's worth of Diet Coke social media discussion. So how people talk about Diet Coke. And again, conventionally, you would do a word cloud and it said Diet Coke, pizza, ice, party, whatever. So far, so uninteresting. And so what we did on that one is that we took the data, put it into the platform, and then split it by time. And what we actually did was that we split it by, this is how people talked about Diet Coke before the ad campaign, and this is how people talk about Diet Coke after the ad campaign. And the difference in the language is the effect the ad campaign has had on how people perceive and talk about Diet Coke. And that is a 10 times increase in value out of exactly the same data that people were just doing a sort of pizza, ice, party word cloud on. You can now understand the effect of the ad campaign on people's perception of your brand just by doing the right comparison. So typically that is how we get used. Okay, you upload the data into the platform. All text data normally comes with metadata, whether it's time or gender or income group or NPS score or whatever it might be. You can then split the data and then do the right comparison, which starts revealing a lot of information about your audiences, or how things change over time, or how things are different by geography, and so on and so on.
And is it easy to use? Because when you're looking at that comparison, you need a starting point of what to compare. So I could imagine there's a lot of trial and error, I guess, unless the client has a very specific requirement, they know that they're looking at a different age group, for example. So is that an easy process for them to go through?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, fundamentally what we do is that, you're just picking two things to compare. Conceptually, it's a pretty easy thing. And actually, most customers, when they use it, we have this kind of, it's almost obvious. It's kind of like, well, why haven't we been doing this in the first place? So all you end up doing is that you can upload your data. It's normally in an Excel. We'll accept any Excel data set. Okay. So whether that's your survey output or your social media output or whatever it might be, you just upload that into the platform. We take care of all of that ingestion of the data and all the metadata. And then you just choose whether you want to do the split by brand or whether you want to do the split by store or whatever it might be. It automatically gets split, and then it will display the differences. And then you just drill down into that to understand what's critical for your business.
And then I guess they can map that, stitch that back into the other structured survey data that they have, or the SIX data, for example.
That's a really good example. Yeah. So, for example, in surveys, quite often what customers will do is that, let's say, what's the difference between somebody who ranks you at an 8 or a 9 out of 10 and somebody who's ranking you as 6 or a 7? Okay. By comparing the sort of 8s and 9s with the 6s and 7s, you understand the difference in the feedback of the customer. So then you understand what will get you, what will get those 6s and 7s into being 8s and 9s. Or same thing for review data, for example, as well. Yeah.
So it's really evident there is some very tactical ROI that you can see coming out of that, almost measurable, would you say? Have you had clients that have been able to measure the impact?
Yeah, so that kind of question leads into how do you measure impact of consumer insights and so on altogether. And there are examples of customers who've used relative insight, found out that they should be saying where and not apply, and that's had a measurable uptick in ads. We've had examples where click-through rates on ads have gone up 60% by just saying the right thing to the right people. But then a lot of the other ROI and relative insight is just on speed to insight compared to what customers were already doing. So there are still a lot of people out there who've got a lot of, say, open ends in surveys, and there are people sat there reading them. Or they are what the industry calls coding them, which when I learned that, I just flabbergasted what coding actually meant. And I'm sure the listeners, who are all sort of expert market researchers, know what coding is. But when we came into the industry as tech practitioners, you hear the word coding, and I thought this was a technical phrase, right? And then I'll never forget the meeting I was in with a big insight vendor who will remain nameless at the moment, who then proceeded to tell me what coding was and how they charge $1 per open end, which people will read and sort of segment and mark. And I just couldn't believe that was happening. And I think that things like that in the industry, I think in some cases set a conventional wisdom on people's attitudes to, say, open ends in surveys. I think a lot of the time people don't want to put in open ends, not because they don't think it's a good research methodology. It's just that they're put off because what they're used to being charged is like $1 per open end being transcribed, so then nobody puts them in. And those days are gone. It's crazy that people are still charging that, and there's no need now for people to be sat there manually going through open ends. Technology's got to the point where you can get much quicker, obviously because it's computerized, like orders of magnitude quicker, but also a lot more objective. It is completely objective, and the amount of value that you get out of those data sets is not only faster, quicker, but it's also increased massively. And these are all things which are going to continue as trends, which lead us to believe that text analytics is going to become a bigger and bigger part of the business intelligence mix.
Makes sense. So just expanding a bit on that, because I kind of mentioned about the tactical benefits of things. So you seeing, as it becomes a bigger part of the marketing mix, any more strategic kind of implications or values, uses that clients might have for it?
Yeah. So I think one of the things we've seen is, whether we get used by brand, insight groups extensively, and some agencies as well, both, marketing agencies and also market research agencies. One of the things we're starting to see is the repeated use of data that people already have. So quite often these departments are being asked to, there's all kinds of requests come flying over the fence, okay, and you have to kind of triage them and get them done and so on and so on. But in the course of doing that, people are collecting quite a lot of data. And what we're now starting to see is customers using the data, in particular the text data that they're gathering, and using it as a strategic data resource. So I'll give you a real example. We have a customer who handles the advertising strategy for a very big mobile phone brand in North America. And they've been using Relative Insight for a few years. And over the course of that time, they've uploaded over 1 billion words, 1 billion words of how people talk about mobile phones in North America. And they've done that initially as part of standalone projects, standalone insight briefs, which are required in the day-to-day. But as they've gone through that, they are now looking back at all of that data that they've uploaded, and they've got more data on how people talk about mobile phones in North America than practically anyone else in the world. And that becomes a something of real strategic value for them. And what they're now doing is taking that kind of what was sort of ad hoc projects into much more of a strategic data level. So they now understand how different brands are discussed in comparison to one another. So for example, how is Samsung talked about in comparison to Apple? Or how has Apple been discussed and how's that changed over time? Or how has the different mobile phone service providers, how have they changed over time? And all the different permutations around this. And they've got this going back several years now. And this is of like real value to them, because it's now not about ad hoc projects, it's about tactical business strategy input from a data, again, like people already have, but just need to pull it together and need to be able to quickly analyze it on a strategic level. So that would be a classic example. But there's other examples around customer service. Again, we've had instances of people who use us for NPS, for in-store surveys. They've seen that NPS has gone down, but they didn't know why. By using Relative Insight, they could get a macro level view of why the decrease has been going on for like over several months or even years. And then even within Relative Insight, you can actually isolate which particular stores are contributing most to that decline and what the specific reasons in those stores are for that decline. And again, this is all based on the data that people are already collecting. So you're going from, well, our NPS is going down, what should we do about it, to, well, it's going down and we know exactly why it's going down, because of which stores and because of which problems. And so what that means is that you can just go and fix it.
It sounds amazing. And, it sounds so obvious as the way forward with text analytics, or how people should be using their verbatims and getting the most out of that data. Do you get much kind of nervousness or apprehension from clients about taking this approach or changing up the way they do it? Or in the most of people, happy to take it up and excited? Or
yeah, I think people normally approach us from, I think there's two sort of different perspectives people normally take. So I think the first is, they're not really using text analytics at all. So it's either never crossed their mind to do it, or they maybe tried to do it, but probably a few years ago, when the dreaded word cloud and sentiment analysis was that was the peak of, that was sort of state of the art, which was kind of exciting for a while. And then people started to really question why that was there. And so that's maybe colored their view of text analytics. So once we talked about what can be done, and I'd say specifically around the sort of data sources they're struggling with, actually. So, are you struggling with review data? Are you struggling with open-ended surveys and things like that? Then that uncovers the need pretty quickly, actually. So I think people buy into text analytics at the strategic level pretty easily. But what we really focus on is that, okay, how can we solve some real tactical problems for you now? And that generally is around the data source that they've got and they're struggling with. So that's by far, that is like the biggest group of customers. And I think at the last stats I saw, like only 25% of companies actually use text analytics in any form, which is kind of surprising, actually, because as a discipline, it's been around for ages. But what we tend to find is that a lot of our customers tend to be quant-based teams who are now starting to introduce text analytics as a kind of qual technique into their quant-based teams. Right. So I think that's another level that we normally were talking to quant-based people. And once they understand that they can really easily plug in what we do as a really valuable extra layer to what they do, then normally it's the floodgates open, and the challenge is actually picking a thing to focus on rather than thinking of things to do with it.
Exactly. I would imagine it's about, holding yourself back once you know the ability of what you can do and, the power you can get out of it. So, I mean, you talked about the past, and so obviously what you do now is the present. Where do you see the future of text analytics going then? What else is out there, or what else are you guys looking into?
So, I mean, I think there's two big macro themes, I think, emerging. So one is, and both of which won't be a surprise for people to think that I think this sort of endorses why text analytics is going to be big. Okay. So the first is, I think during the pandemic, we've had a lot of people, there's more and more demand being put on consumer analytic teams, market research teams, CX teams, to really find out what is going on with the marketplace consumers, what do they care about, So the demand for more and more business intelligence, and in particular the why questions, that's not going to stop anytime soon, and that's only going to get bigger and bigger. So text analytics has a big part to play there. I think, we're also seeing more and more companies having consumer analytics and market research play a more and more strategic role in the company. So a good proxy for this is kind of the number of companies having chief data officers, for example, is increasing and increasing. And that is normally a pretty reasonable barometer for the demand on data sources and analytic techniques. And that's going nowhere but up. I think that there's another trend which we're seeing, which is really in the adjacent technology space, and that's cloud data. So there's a lot of progress being made in essentially making data available to be analyzed. That's really what cloud data is. So whether that's Azure or Amazon or Snowflake or whatever other or Matillion or all of these companies, whatever they're their whole purpose is to make data more accessible. And the point of making it more accessible is that you can do more, better analysis on that data. And so more and more text data is therefore being surfaced as being available to analyze. So I think any analytic vendor and any probably consumer insight professional, market research professional knows one of the big hurdles you've got to overcome before you do anything significant is to get the data and get decent data and get it into the platform. And there's some really big strides coming in technology to enable that, and that's coming pretty quick.
So for people who are interested in finding out more about you, are you getting out there? Are we seeing you at any of the conferences or showcases out there? Or are you on the circuit?
Are we on the circuit? I think we're now at the so pretty regularly we're doing, we do Quirks, we're at TMRE in the States, we do IIEX, and yes, we are out there and around. It's been quite interesting actually this year. Obviously it's been nice to get back to physical events, and I was in New York last week for Quirks, for instance. I'd say a year ago, people, when we were doing events, people were kind of thinking, why are you here?
Really?
A little bit of that. And we had to explain why we thought text analytics is a thing. This year, it's been quite a marked change. So nobody's kind of asking us why we are at those shows. Like, people absolutely understand why we are at those shows. And also, which is rather nice, when we kind of rock up, we've got a lot of customers who are already using us. We already meet at the shows as well, so that's always kind of quite gratifying. So we are out there. We are expanding in the States. We've got 3 offices, soon to be 4. So we've got in the UK, we've got Lancaster, London, and then in the States we're in Brooklyn, but we're soon opening up in Philadelphia as well. Well over 60% of our revenue actually comes out of the States. So we're very, very effective at selling to and servicing customers in the States, and they're just, from our point of view, there's just going to be more and more of that coming for us.
And actually, talking about places, regions and globally, how does the platform and your services work in other regions and other languages? And everything I traditionally see about text analytics is primarily English, and then it's always that question, but can you handle things? Have you got capabilities there, and revenue coming in from other regions?
Yeah, so I mean, it's true to say that we primarily focus on the UK, US, but we also basically any other European-based language we can handle. Okay, and so that's the thrust of the strategy at the moment. We've got some experiments running around some Asian languages, but certainly all the demand we're getting is kind of UK, Europe, and primarily the US for us.
So it's all very interesting. I want to do it myself now. So just before we recap, I guess if you had to give some advice to people out there, so research buyers who are considering it, or maybe even research agencies who are kind of struggling with the traditional coding approach, what would you kind of advise for people for undertaking this? What's the first thing they need to consider?
So I think the first thing is probably think quite broadly about the data sources you will undoubtedly already have. That's probably the first thing. So whether that's social output, so if you want to get more than the usual word cloud that you get in a social listening tool, you can export that to Relative Insight. People normally have got lots of open-end surveys. You can export that to Relative Insight. You might have focus group transcriptions. You might have IDIs. You might have, CX transcriptions. There's all kinds of interesting things going on there. So you have undoubtedly got a whole bunch of data, and normally, and this is one of the things you sort of see at shows all the time is, but basically go to the show, talk to vendors, buy more data, and sometimes that's the answer. But quite often the answer is better analysis of the data you've already got or got access to. Yeah. Right. And text is a real candidate for really helping you extract 10 times, 20 times more value out of the data you've already bought and paid for and have got sat there. And it is actually quite a straightforward process. So that would be the first thing to think about. I think the other interesting thing is looking at, again, if we go back to the ROI, sometimes you get data from your existing relationships which maybe goes unanalyzed. So by properly analyzing the data you're already receiving or the data you've already got, it means you're sort of saving money on not having to do new research in new areas. And sometimes that is a really strong ROI as well. So that's another kind of critical point. And I think the other thing to think about text is we've got some really interesting trends. I think other trends going on at the moment at a strategic level across all companies. So the things I'm thinking about here are, we've got some really interesting. So hey, look, let me rewind. Okay, so I've just answered the question when it comes to people who are maybe not doing text analytics. I guess there's another answer for people who, okay, you're doing good text analytics, hopefully with relative insight, but I'll be happy if you're doing it with anyone. Well, then you need to think about other ways you can apply it. And there's some really interesting trends going on in the market, which might be worth talking about. So one of the big macro things at the moment is the sort of collapse of cookies. And what that is doing is that it's putting more and more emphasis onto first-party data that companies have. First-party data is becoming more and more important. And it's important not just to sort of consumer analytics and market research, it's also important to CX and so on. What's interesting, though, is that quite a lot of first-party data, in fact, in a lot of companies, the biggest holder of first-party data actually is CX. And we're starting to see some really great projects going on where market research or consumer insight groups are using CX data, first-party data, to inform their strategies and their recommendations. So quite often, the valuable data in your company might not even be in your department. It might be in another group. And we're starting to see some really interesting examples going on there. Another example which is starting to happen as well is the combination of quant and text analytic data together. So we're involved in a few projects at the moment where customers have conventional segmentation databases, which are used for all kinds of purposes. But essentially, it's a bunch of quant data around their customer base. So that tells you who those people are. And what we're now doing is putting open-end questions out to the people in that database. And by doing that, we can understand how those people are talking in response to certain questions. So that might be, ad testing, or it might be, what do they think about the service or competitors or whatever it might be. And you can then layer those text analysis responses. How do people talk? And you can layer that onto the segments. And what is really fascinating is then comparing how the two different segments respond to the same question. So what are the differences in how they're responding? And is that surprising you, or is that as expected? And it's really, really interesting. So sometimes you've got differences that you would never expect in not only how they talk about things, but the topics they talk about, how they express themselves. So for example, one group might, they love the ad because they love the voiceover, they love the actor involved or whatever, but another group might really dislike the actor. They think the messages are too flaky or whatever it might be. And so sometimes, the differences are really big. And this is really, really valuable for optimizing in that case, your ad strategy. So, do you need to do one ad, or do you need to do 3 ads, or do you only need to do 2 ads as opposed to the 6 you thought you might want to do? So quite often the other thing is that you look at you would expect differences between segments based on the quant data, and it turns out there's actually 0 difference at all in their perception. And that's really interesting too, because you would think, sometimes in segmentation exercises, they might be either completely identical in their quant data, in where they live, in the car they drive, or whatever, segmentation data you've got. You'd think they would be exactly the same. But actually, when they answer, they're very, very different. But then the converse frequently applies as well. You would expect them to be very, very different, but it turns out they're almost exactly the same in their responses.
And I can see how that can be a fundamental understanding with segmentations when we know they're expensive, time-consuming, and heavily relied on techniques. If you're taking a segmentation that, clients believe is what's going to drive their business structure and their customer-centric approach, if those segments, although they appear different, actually aren't behaving differently or aren't reacting to the brand differently, you could potentially be wasting a lot of money, right? Trying to segment the market, target them in this way, when all the time you could have spoken to them either with the same message or, conversely, a different message within the segment.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually heard an example of this at a show where someone was not connected with Relative Insight, and they kind of come up with the same kind of concept. And they had segmentation database. It was, I think it was working mums in the US, and they had like 2 groups, exactly the same segmentation database, right? Same number of kids, same area, same income, similar job, everything was the same. And then you ask the open end, what's your sort of, I think they call it the mommy motto. And one group was basically, I'll do anything for my kids. And the other group was, I go with the flow. And that tells you that even though the segmentation, the quant data points are exactly the same, those might be 2 very different groups.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think they're quite distinct, that you need to talk to them in very different ways, right?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I could keep talking all afternoon, but I will let you get on. I guess what I'd like to do is let me attempt to quickly summarize everything you've said, and please correct me if there's anything I've missed or misunderstood. But essentially what you guys have done in what sounds like an extremely successful way is take something that originated in what would you call it, law and order, or
Yep.
basically in the legal system for understanding fundamentally consumers or actually it's just people's text and the way people speak, but focusing on the differences, predominantly looking at the differences, and then taking that, which was hugely successful for the police force, and then turning that into a concept and a product for the commercial sector, being able to identify and have significant ROI for understanding different target audiences, understanding the way to talk to them, I guess understanding, in fact, even the way you gather that text analytics data from them, how you ask the questions in the first place, and taking advantage of all the data that currently is available for customers, for clients, so they don't have to necessarily spend more money gathering more data, reinvesting in research. You're essentially adding ROI to the current data they have, and also their structured data sources, their market research, their CX, their collected internal metrics, by combining that all together with the differences you see in their text data.
Perfect. That's great. Yeah. I mean, I think this is the thing that really excites me about, I mean, I've been in tech like all my career, and I think this is a fantastic example of a different way of thinking, because we didn't come from the industry that we're servicing. We came from outside, so we thought about the problem differently, and then we take that new way of thinking to data that people already have in a simple concept, which gets value add results, 10x more value out of the data people have got. There's not many instances where you can do that. So that's, I think, really excited about relative insight. I'm very proud of what we've built. I'm excited about the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. Likewise. Well, I just want to say a big thanks for joining us today, Ben. That was so interesting, and as I said, I'm very excited to see where things go. And thanks also to all of you who have tuned in. If you like what you've heard today, please do subscribe to the podcast. Feel free to share it with others, leave a review. We'd really appreciate that. And thanks for listening to Now That's Significant, and catch up with you soon. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.